10 years searching for a husband who vanished in time, the millionaire became pain, longing, and deep silence, until she walked into the church and heard that voice, and the past screamed from within the altar. Subscribe and leave your like before continuing. You will be moved like few times in your life. Marina woke up before the alarm clock, as always. The habit of waking early had begun 10 years ago, when sleep became hostile territory, full of dreams that mixed memories and fantasies about a man who had disappeared without a trace. She looked at the bedroom ceiling, the same damp stain she observed every morning, and took a deep breath. Another day. Another attempt to find meaning in a life that seemed to have stopped in time. She got up, made coffee, and sat at the small kitchen table. The apartment in Kensington, West London, was simple but cozy, very different from the mansion where she had lived in her first few months of marriage, with its enormous rooms, impeccable gardens, and suffocating solitude. When Daniel disappeared, she couldn't bear to stay in that house. The walls seemed to scream his name. She sold everything, ignored his family's protests, and moved to a place where she could breathe, or at least try to. Daniel. Just thinking his name made her chest tighten. Daniel Carpenter Manning, heir to one of the country's largest real estate conglomerates, the man everyone knew from the pages of business magazines, from charity dinners, from the inaugurations of buildings that pierced the London skyline. But to Marina, he was just Daniel, the man who laughed too loudly when he was nervous, who liked coffee without sugar, and loved walking through the city in the early hours of the morning when the streets were empty, and he could pretend to be an ordinary person. The man who proposed to her on a rainy Sunday without a ring, without planning, just with the certainty that he didn't want to live without her. They married in a discreet ceremony, against his family's wishes. The Carpenter Mannings did not approve of Marina. She didn't have a prestigious surname, no fortune, no connections. She was just a music teacher who had met Daniel by chance in a cafe in the city centre when he had escaped a tedious meeting and she was waiting for a friend who never arrived. They talked for hours. He lied about his surname. She thought he was just another rushed Londoner who, by some miracle, had decided to slow down. The marriage lasted 3 months, 90 days. Marina still counted, even after a decade. 3 months of stolen happiness, of hidden dinners, of whispered promises in the dark. 3 months until one August morning, Daniel left for a meeting and never came back. There was no phone call, no letter, no body. Just emptiness. His family's lawyers said he had abandoned her, that he was probably somewhere in the world starting a new life, free from the responsibilities that suffocated him. His mother, Eliza Carpenter Manning, a woman of impeccable posture and an icy gaze, suggested Marina accept a generous settlement and move on. Daniel's younger brother, Roderick, was more direct. He said his brother was never made for commitments, that Marina should have realized that before marrying him. But Marina didn't believe any of those versions. She knew Daniel. She knew the way he looked at her, how he held her hand when he thought no one was watching, how he spoke about the future with a conviction that disarmed any cynicism. Daniel was not a coward. Something had happened, and for 10 years she refused to stop searching. The search consumed her life. Marina visited hospitals, morgues, police stations, shelters. She spoke with former employees of his company, with Daniel's childhood friends, with people who claimed to have seen him in distant towns. She hired private detectives, scoured public records, traveled through communities where men without identity tried to rebuild their lives. She volunteered in outreach centers, orphanages, and institutions that helped vulnerable people. Part of her did this to fill the immense void Daniel had left. Part of her believed that if she helped other people find their loved ones, perhaps the universe would conspire for her to find hers. In the first few years, those around her tried to convince her to give up. Her mother, Mrs. Lucy, a strong woman who had raised Marina alone after her father left them, gently told her it was time to move on, that Marina was still young and deserved to be happy. Her friends suggested she go back to teaching music, allow herself to meet other people, not waste her life waiting for a ghost. But Marina couldn't. Every time she thought about giving up, something inside her refused. A stubborn, almost irrational intuition that insisted, he is alive, he still exists, and someday, somehow, you will find each other. It was on a Thursday afternoon, at St. Clair's Outreach Centre in South London, that everything changed. Marina was helping a group of children with music activities. She brought an old guitar, taught simple songs, tried to coax smiles from faces that had seen more than any child should see. Among the children was an 8-year-old boy named Peter, too thin with large, curious eyes. Peter was one of the most engaged, always asking questions, always wanting to know more about everything. That day, after the activity, Peter tugged at Marina's sleeve and said with genuine enthusiasm that she should meet the pastor of the church he attended on Sundays. He said the pastor was different, that he spoke in a way that made people cry and smile at the same time, that he seemed to understand everyone's pain. Marina smiled and thanked him, without giving it much thought. She had stopped attending churches after Daniel's disappearance. Not that she had stopped believing, but she felt that God no longer listened to her, or perhaps she had stopped listening to him. But Peter insisted. He said the pastor organized community lunches every Sunday, helped homeless families, and talked to everyone as if they were true friends. And then, almost without realizing the importance of what he was saying, Peter showed her a photo on a borrowed phone from one of the center's coordinators. It was a photo taken during a service, with several people's backs to the camera and in the background, on the small improvised stage. A thin man with a scruffy beard, a microphone in his hand and his eyes closed, as if immersed in deep prayer. Marina took the phone to get a better look, and the world stopped. The face was thinner, more marked, with lines that weren't there 10 years ago. The beard covered part of his features, and his hair, which used to be neatly cut, was now longer, disheveled. But it was him. Every detail, every feature, every shadow of that face was Daniel's. She felt her hands tremble. The phone almost fell. Peter asked if she was okay, but Marina couldn't answer. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it would explode. 10 years. 10 years of searching, and there he was in a simple photo in a neighborhood church, preaching to people who probably had no idea who he really was. She returned the phone, mumbled some excuse, and left the center in a state of shock. She walked aimlessly through the streets of London, trying to process what she had just seen. It could be a mistake. It could be someone similar. But Marina knew that face better than her own. She knew the curve of his nose, the shape of his eyes, the way his lips curved even when he wasn't smiling. It was Daniel. It had to be. She returned to the center the next day and, trying to appear casual, asked more about the church. Peter was radiant to see Marina was interested. He said the New Path Church was in Peckham, an outer borough in South London. He said the pastor, whom everyone called Pastor Luke, had been there for about 5 years, that he had appeared one day out of nowhere, a bit lost, and that the previous pastor had taken him in. Over time, Pastor Luke had become a beloved figure in the community. He visited families, helped with what he could, organized donation campaigns, and preached in a way that touched people deeply. Peter said the pastor never talked about the past, that he seemed to be someone who was starting life anew. Marina mentally noted all the information. Pastor Luke, New Path Church, Peckham. Every detail was precious. She needed to be sure. She needed to see with her own eyes. But at the same time, she felt afraid. What if it was him? What if after 10 years, all the pain, all the searching, he looked at her as if she were a stranger? What if he had really abandoned her, had chosen that life instead of a life with her? The questions multiplied, but Marina knew she had no choice. She had to go. The following Sunday, Marina woke up even earlier than usual. She changed clothes 3 times, unable to decide what to wear. She chose something simple, discreet, that wouldn't draw attention. She took the tube to the nearest station in Peckham and then a bus. The journey was long, almost 2 hours of London traversing itself, each borough a city within the city. When she got off the bus, the sun was already high, and the typical London Sunday heat made the air shimmer over the asphalt. The New Path Church was not hard to find. It was a modest white-painted hall with a simple sign and a small cross on the facade. People were already entering, whole families, children running, elderly people greeting each other. Marina entered slowly, choosing a spot at the back where she could observe without being noticed. The interior was humble, but clean and well-maintained. There were plastic chairs lined up, a small stage with a wooden pulpit, and a group of musicians tuning instruments. Marina sat and waited. Her heart pounded erratically. Her hands were sweating. She crossed her arms, trying to control herself, trying to prepare for what she was about to see. The service began with songs. Marina closed her eyes and tried to breathe. After the songs, there were prayers, announcements, and finally someone announced that Pastor Luke would deliver the day's sermon. And then he entered. Marina opened her eyes and saw Daniel Carpenter Manning, the man she had loved, she had searched for. She had cried for 10 years walking towards the pulpit. He wore a simple white shirt. Jeans, no luxury, no trace of his old life. He was thinner, his skin a bit darker from the sun, his hair longer and graying at the temples. But it was him. It was Daniel. Marina felt tears burn in her eyes. She pressed her lips together to make no sound. Her entire body trembled. Daniel began to speak. His voice was the same, but there was something different in the tone. He spoke softly, with a patience she didn't remember seeing before. He spoke of new beginnings, of how God embraces those who get lost, of how love is love, stronger than any abandonment. Marina listened to every word as if they were directed at her, and perhaps they were. Perhaps somehow he knew she was there. After the sermon, there were more songs and prayers. Marina barely paid attention. Her eyes were fixed on him. She observed every movement, every gesture, every expression. He smiled at people, greeted children, talked to the parishioners. It was as if Daniel had transformed into another person. But at the same time, it was still him. And Marina didn't know what to do with this contradiction. When the service ended, Marina remained seated. As people left, she needed to talk to him. She needed to confirm she wasn't going crazy. She needed to hear from his mouth that it was real. She waited until most people had left. Daniel was talking to an elderly woman near the stage. Marina stood up, her legs trembling, and walked towards him. Each step seemed to last an eternity. When she got close, Daniel looked up and saw her. For a fraction of a second, something crossed his face. A flicker, a recognition. But almost immediately he looked away, returned to talking to the old woman as if Marina were just another person in the crowd. She waited for the woman to say goodbye and leave. And then, finally, they were alone. Marina opened her mouth, but no words came out. What do you say to someone who disappeared from your life and is now in front of you, alive, breathing, but pretending to be someone else? Daniel looked at her, and this time the gaze lasted longer. He was pale. His hands trembled slightly. He knew who she was. Of course he knew. Marina finally found her voice, weak but firm enough to be heard. She said his name, Daniel. Just that. Just the name she had repeated on so many lonely nights, in so many desperate prayers, in so many moments when she thought she would go mad. Daniel. He shook his head, said she was mistaken, that his name was Luke, that she must be confusing him with someone else. But his voice faltered. He averted his eyes. He was sweating. Marina took a step forward. She said she wasn't mistaken, that she was sure, that she would recognize that face anywhere, under any circumstance. She spoke about their marriage, about his disappearance, about the 10 years of searching. She spoke quickly, urgently, as if fearing he would disappear again if she delayed too long. Daniel, or Luke, or whoever he was now, kept denying it. But Marina didn't give up. She recalled details only the two of them knew. She remembered the scar on his left shoulder from a childhood bicycle fall. She remembered the song he hummed in the shower, an old Tom Jobim tune his father used to play. She remembered the way he drank coffee, always waiting for it to get too cold before taking the first sip. Every detail was proof, evidence, an anchor she threw in an attempt to pull him back. And then, almost without thinking, Marina began to sing. Softly, with a trembling voice, she sang the song they used to listen to together in the early mornings when the world slept and they stayed awake in the living room of the old mansion, dancing barefoot in the dark. Aguas de Marzo, closing the summer. Marina's voice was a whisper, but it carried a lifetime of memories. Daniel closed his eyes, and when he opened them there were tears. The resistance he tried to maintain crumbled. He brought his hands to his face, and Marina saw the exact moment the mask fell. He sobbed, a muffled sound, full of pain and relief and fear and recognition. And then he said, his voice broken, that he remembered, that he had always remembered, even when he tried to forget, that he had never been able to erase her face from his memory, not even in the years when he didn't know who he was. Marina felt her own tears fall. She wanted to hug him, wanted to hold that man, and never let go. But at the same time she felt anger for the pain, for the absence, for the stolen decade. She asked why he hadn't come back, why he hadn't looked for her, why he let her suffer believing he was lost, or worse. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her, and Marina saw in his gaze an immense weight, a burden he had carried alone for too long. He said they needed to talk, but not there, not at that moment. He said there were things she needed to know, terrible things, things he never imagined he would have to tell. He asked her to come back the next day to a more secluded place, where they could talk without interruptions. Marina wanted to protest, wanted to demand immediate answers, but she saw a silent plea in his expression. He was afraid that someone would see them together, afraid that someone would find out, afraid of something Marina didn't yet understand. She agreed. She wrote down the address he gave her, a small square near the church, at 7 in the evening the next day. Before leaving, Marina looked at him one last time. Daniel stood motionless, his shoulders stooped by the weight of something invisible. She wanted to say so many things, but all she managed was a whisper, "I never stopped looking for you." Daniel closed his eyes and nodded. She saw that he was fighting his own emotions, fighting the urge to run to her and hug her, but he stayed where he was. And Marina left the church with her heart shattered into pieces she didn't know how to put back together. The rest of Sunday passed in a blur. Marina returned to her apartment, locked herself in her room and cried. She cried with relief at finding him alive. She cried with pain for all she had lost. She cried with anger that he hadn't returned sooner. She cried because, after 10 years, the only thing she was sure of was that she loved that man, and that this love was both a curse and a blessing. On Monday, Marina could barely work. She spent the day watching the clock, counting the hours until the meeting. She tried to mentally prepare for what he would say, but no preparation was possible. At 6:30 in the evening, she left home and took the tube again. The journey seemed longer this time. Each station was an eternity. When she finally arrived at the square, it was exactly 7 o'clock. Daniel was already there, sitting on a bench under a tree, his hands clasped and his head bowed. When he saw Marina approaching, he stood up. They stood facing each other, separated by a meter that seemed like an abyss. Finally, Daniel gestured for her to sit down. Marina sat, and he sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, as if afraid to touch her. And then he began to tell his story. He started from the day he disappeared. Daniel took a deep breath before he began to speak. The words seemed heavy in his mouth, as if each syllable cost immense effort. Marina remained silent, her hands clasped in her lap, preparing to hear something she might not be ready to know. But after 10 years, there was no more room for protection. She needed the truth, no matter how painful. He started by talking about the Carpenter Manning family. Marina knew Daniel's relationship with his family was complicated, but she never imagined the extent of that complication. Daniel said that from a young age he felt the weight of expectations. He was the firstborn, the designated heir, the one who was supposed to take over the empire built by his father and grandfather. But Daniel never wanted that life. He hated the endless meetings, the power games, the falsity of smiles exchanged at dinners where every word was a strategy. He wanted freedom. He wanted to be an ordinary person, away from the spotlight, away from the obligations that stifled any possibility of genuine happiness. When he met Marina, Daniel saw a chance to escape. She was the antithesis of everything his family represented. Authentic, simple, passionate about music and life. With her, Daniel could just be Daniel. Not the heir, not the businessman, just a man trying to find meaning in his own existence. Marrying Marina was the freest decision he had ever made. And also the most dangerous. The Carpenter Manning family did not approve of the union. Daniel's mother, Eliza, made it clear that Marina did not have the appropriate profile to be part of their lineage. His younger brother, Roderick, saw the marriage as Daniel's weakness, proof that he lacked the necessary firmness to lead the company. And his uncle, Marcus Carpenter, a calculating and ambitious man who had always wanted control of the conglomerate, saw Daniel's marriage as an opportunity. Daniel explained that in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, he started noticing strange things. Conversations interrupted when he entered a room, glances exchanged between Roderick and Marcus, meetings from which he was deliberately excluded. He tried to confront his father, but the elder Mr. Carpenter, already weakened by health problems, was withdrawn from business and lived in a kind of voluntary seclusion. Daniel was alone, trying to manage a company that seemed to be conspiring against him. On the morning he disappeared, Daniel received an urgent phone call. It was Roderick saying there was a serious problem at one of the company's construction sites and that Daniel needed to go immediately to the site in Croydon. Daniel didn't suspect anything. He got in his car and went, but when he arrived there was no one there. The site was empty, silent, just the skeleton of an unfinished building and the wind blowing through the concrete structures. That's when he realized he had fallen into a trap. Before he could react, two men approached him. Daniel tried to resist, but he was overpowered. They took him to a car, blindfolded him, and drove him to a place he couldn't identify. For hours, he was locked in a dark room, not knowing what was happening, not understanding why this was happening to him. When they finally removed the blindfold, Daniel found himself facing Marcus. His uncle was sitting in a chair with a cold, calculating expression. It was Marcus who explained everything. He said Daniel was an obstacle, that his inability to be firm, his hesitation in making difficult decisions, and especially his untimely marriage to a woman of no social relevance had proven he was unworthy of leading the company. Marcus said that with Daniel out of the way, Roderick would assume the presidency, and he, Marcus, would have de facto control. Everything was already planned. The documents were ready. Daniel would be declared missing and after a while legally dead. Daniel tried to argue, tried to appeal to some remnant of humanity in his uncle, but Marcus was ruthless. He said Daniel would have two options: accept a considerable sum of money and disappear forever, starting a new life in another country, or refuse and deal with the consequences. When Daniel asked what consequences, Marcus smiled. It was a cold smile, devoid of any emotion. He said that Marina was being watched, that any attempt by Daniel to return or report what was happening would put her life in danger. Daniel felt the world collapse. He didn't care about the money, he didn't care about the company, but he couldn't risk Marina's life. Marcus knew this. He knew that Daniel's love for Marina was the perfect weapon. Daniel pleaded. He said he would do anything, that he would leave the company, that he would sign any document, as long as Marina was safe. Marcus agreed, but with one condition. Daniel would have to truly disappear. No contact, no trace, no return, and that's what happened. Marcus organized everything. Daniel was taken to a secluded place in a rural area in the countryside near London, and there he was kept under surveillance for weeks. During that time, documents were forged, the story of his disappearance was fabricated, and the Carpenter Manning family moved on as if Daniel had never existed. He was erased from the company, from society, from his own family. Marina listened in silence, her eyes fixed on Daniel, tears streaming down her face. Every word was a sharp blade cutting what remained of her heart. She wanted to scream, wanted to hit someone, wanted someone to pay for that monstrosity, but at the same time, she felt a devastating powerlessness. How to fight against people so powerful, so cruel, so willing to destroy lives to maintain control? Daniel continued. He said that after a few weeks, Marcus deemed Daniel sufficiently broken and decided to discard him. In a moment of carelessness by the men guarding him, Daniel tried to escape. He managed to flee, ran along deserted roads in the middle of the night, not knowing where he was going, just trying to get as far away as possible. but he was weak, disoriented, and ended up collapsing on a secondary road. That's when everything became blurry. Daniel woke up in a strange place, surrounded by people he didn't know. He didn't know how much time had passed since he fled. He didn't know where he was, and worse still, he didn't know who he was. His memory was fragmented, loose pieces that made no sense. He remembered images, sensations, but couldn't connect anything. He didn't remember his own name, his own history, or Marina. The people who found him were homeless. They lived in a precarious squat under a flyover in East London. They took him in, shared food with him, cared for him as best they could. Daniel spent months living there, trying to remember who he was, but his memory simply wouldn't return. All he knew was that he was lost, and that somehow he needed to find a path. One day, one of the residents took Daniel to the New Path Church. The pastor at the time, Pastor Anthony, was known for helping vulnerable people. He welcomed Daniel without asking questions. He gave him clothes, food, and a place to sleep. He also offered him something Daniel didn't know he was looking for: purpose. Pastor Anthony said that God had a plan for everyone, and that perhaps God's plan for Daniel was to help other people who were as lost as he was. Daniel began attending the church. He helped with activities, participated in services, talked to the parishioners. Without memory, without a past, he became a blank slate, and little by little he filled that slate with a new identity. He became Luke, a simple, humble man who lived to serve. He studied the Bible, learned to preach, and when Pastor Anthony fell ill and had to step down, it was Daniel, now Luke, who took over the leadership of the congregation. For years, Daniel lived as Luke without questioning. Life was difficult, but there was a strange peace in it. He helped families, visited the sick, preached about love and forgiveness. And in a way, he was happy, or at least he thought he was, until the memories began to return. It was gradual. First, they were just flashes, images of a brown-haired woman with deep eyes, music playing somewhere, the smell of coffee, vague sensations that made no sense. But over time, the flashes became clearer. Daniel began to remember entire scenes: a dark room, a flyover, men holding him. And then, one night when he couldn't sleep, his memory returned completely. Everything. His marriage to Marina, his family's betrayal, the kidnapping, the escape. It all came back at once, like a flood destroying whatever he had built in his new life. Daniel said that when he remembered everything, he was paralyzed. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to run to Marina, hug her, beg forgiveness for disappearing. But at the same time, he was afraid that Marcus was still watching, afraid that returning would put Marina in danger, afraid that she would hate him for abandoning her. And above all, he felt overwhelming guilt. He had rebuilt his life while Marina suffered. He had found a kind of peace while she tore herself apart looking for him. How could he look her in the eyes and say he had been alive all this time? So he chose to do nothing. He chose to continue being Pastor Luke, to continue living in the outer borough, to continue helping those people. He convinced himself that it was best for Marina, that she deserved more than a broken man, without money, without a future, living a life that wasn't his. He convinced himself that if he truly loved her, he should let her move on. Marina couldn't take it anymore. She stood up from the bench, trembling, her fists clenched. She looked at Daniel with a mixture of love and fury she didn't even know she was capable of feeling. She said he had no right to decide for her, that he had no right to let her suffer for years thinking he was dead or had abandoned her. She said love wasn't about selfish protection, but about trusting the other person, about giving them the chance to choose. Daniel tried to respond, but Marina interrupted him. She said he was a coward, that by choosing to hide, by choosing not to return, he had abandoned her in the worst possible way, not with a goodbye, but with silence, with omission. She said he had no idea of the hell she had lived through, the nights she cried, until she had no more tears, the times she thought of giving up everything because the pain was too great. And then Marina stopped. She took a deep breath. The tears kept falling, but she needed to say one more thing. She looked at Daniel, and with a choked but firm voice she said that even after everything, even after the anger and the betrayal and the pain, she still loved him. And that was what hurt the most. Because love shouldn't be a curse, but at that moment, that's exactly what it seemed to be. Daniel was also crying. Now, he stood up, took a step towards Marina, but she recoiled. She wasn't ready to be touched by him. Not yet, perhaps never. She said she needed time, that she needed to process everything he had told her, that she needed to decide what to do with it all. And before Daniel could say anything, Marina turned and began to walk away. Daniel called her name, Marina. The name came out as a desperate cry. She stopped, but didn't turn around. Daniel said he understood if she could never forgive him, but there was something he needed her to. No, he never forgot her. Even in the years when he didn't remember who he was, something in him remembered her. A constant presence, an emptiness he couldn't explain, and when his memory returned, his first thought was her. It was always her. Marina remained motionless for a moment. Then, without saying anything, she continued walking. She left Daniel alone in the square, with the weight of a decade of secrets and a truth that might have arrived too late. In the following weeks, Marina did not return to the church. She did not look for Daniel. She locked herself in her apartment whenever she wasn't working, trying to process everything she had discovered. Anger and love alternated within her, an internal struggle that seemed to have no winner. Part of her wanted to forgive him, to understand that he too had been a victim, that his family was the real culprit, but another part couldn't forget that he had a chance to come back and chose not to. He chose silence. Mrs. Lucy, her mother, noticed something was wrong. She tried to talk, but Marina couldn't discuss it. How to explain that the man she had searched for 10 years was alive, but that the reunion hadn't brought the happiness she had imagined? How to say that the truth, instead of freeing her, had trapped her even more? Meanwhile, Daniel tried to follow his routine at the church, but everything seemed different now. The sermons lost their strength. The words that once came out with conviction now seemed empty. He saw Marina in every face in the congregation, heard her voice in every song, felt her presence in every silence, and he knew that if she decided never to speak to him again, he would have to accept it. But hope, stubborn and painful, insisted on remaining. It was Peter who unknowingly provoked the next meeting. He appeared at St. Clair's Outreach Center one Friday afternoon and asked for Marina. He said that Pastor Luke had been very sad lately, that it seemed like he had lost someone. Peter asked if Marina knew what was happening, if she could help in any way. Marina felt her heart clench. Even a child noticed Daniel's pain. She thanked Peter and promised she would try to help. But when she was alone, Marina realized she couldn't keep running forever. The truth had been revealed, but the story wasn't over. There were questions that still needed answers, and above all, there was a powerful and dangerous family that needed to pay for what they had done. Marina decided she would go back. Not for Daniel, not for herself, but for justice. The Carpenter Manning family had destroyed their lives, forged documents, threatened and manipulated, and if Marina did nothing, they would remain unpunished. They would continue to destroy lives. Daniel deserved to have his name back. He deserved the world to know the truth. And she, Marina, deserved to close that chapter the right way. On a Saturday afternoon, Marina returned to Peckham. This time, she didn't go to the church. She went directly to the house where Daniel lived, a small terraced house he shared with other members of the congregation. When she knocked on the door, it was Daniel who answered. He was surprised to see her, his eyes wide, as if he were seeing a ghost. Marina entered without waiting for an invitation. The house was simple, clean, with little furniture. There was a Bible on the table, a few photos of church activities on the wall, nothing that reminded her of the luxurious life Daniel once had. They sat in the small living room, and Marina got straight to the point. She said she wanted justice, that she wanted Marcus, Roderick, and everyone involved to pay for what they did. And for that, she needed Daniel's help. Daniel hesitated. He said he understood what Marina wanted, but he was afraid. Afraid of what Marcus might do, afraid of putting Marina in danger again, afraid of reliving it all. But Marina was firm. She said she was no longer afraid, that she had already lost 10 years of her life because of their fear, that she wouldn't lose another day. She looked at Daniel and asked if he trusted her, if, after everything, he could still trust that she would do whatever it took to protect him, to fight by his side. Daniel looked into her eyes, and for the first time since their reunion, he saw the Marina he had known, the strong, determined woman who didn't buckle under storms. And he realized that if there was one person in the world he could trust, it was her. Daniel agreed. He said he would do whatever was necessary, that he would tell everything, that he would help gather evidence. But before they started, he asked for one thing. He asked for forgiveness. He didn't expect Marina to forgive him at that moment. Perhaps she never would, but he needed to say it. He needed her to know that he regretted every second he spent away, every wrong decision, every moment of cowardice. Marina didn't answer immediately. She looked at her own hands, at the wedding ring she still wore on her finger, despite everything. It was a simple silver ring that Daniel had given her on their wedding day because they didn't have money for anything more expensive. Marina never took it off. Even in the most difficult moments, even when everyone told her she should move on, she kept the ring. It was a reminder of love, of pain, of promises. Finally, Marina looked up and said that forgiveness wasn't something that happened overnight, that it would take time, perhaps a long time, for her to be able to forgive completely. But she also said that she understood that Daniel was as much a victim as she was, that the real enemy was not him but those who had orchestrated everything, and that if they were going to fight, they needed to fight together. Daniel nodded. He knew he didn't deserve Marina's generosity, but he was grateful for it. And for the first time in years, he felt something he had forgotten was possible. Hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a chance, not to go back to what they were, but to build something new, something that respected the pain, but was not defined by it. They began to plan. Marina said she knew a lawyer, Dr. Beatrice Phillips, who was known for taking difficult cases involving injustices against people without resources. Marina had met her years ago when Beatrice did volunteer work at the same community center where Marina helped. They became friends, and Marina knew that if anyone could face the Carpenter Manning family, it was Beatrice. Daniel agreed. He also mentioned that there was a man, Julian Anderson, who had been Marcus's rival in the company many years ago. Julian had been unfairly removed, and Daniel remembered hearing rumors that Julian held a grudge and had evidence against Marcus. Perhaps if they found Julian, he could be an ally. Marina wrote everything down. Every name, every detail, every possible path. She knew that what they were about to do was dangerous, that Marcus wouldn't let Daniel return without a fight. But Marina also knew that the time had come. 10 years was too long, and if she had learned anything in all those years, it was that silence never protected anyone. It only perpetuated the pain. Before leaving, Marina looked at Daniel once more. He stood near the door, hands in his pockets, his shoulders still stooped by the weight of the past. But there was something different in his gaze. A spark, a remnant of the person he once was. And Marina realized that perhaps Daniel was still there somewhere, trying to find his way back. She said nothing. She just nodded and left. But this time, unlike the last, Marina knew she would return. Because now they had a mission, and together or separately, wounded or healed, they would see it through to the end. The following Monday, Marina scheduled a meeting with Dr. Beatrice Phillips. Beatrice's office was in a modest commercial building in central London, quite different from the high-end law firms that occupied the skyscrapers of Oxford Street. But Marina knew that it was precisely this difference that made Beatrice the right person. She didn't work for the powerful. She worked against them. Beatrice was a woman in her 40s with short hair and a firm demeanor. She wore thick-rimmed glasses and had a direct way of speaking that dispensed with pleasantries. When Marina entered the room, Beatrice stood up and hugged her with the affection of someone who hadn't seen a friend in too long. They sat down, and Marina began to tell everything. From Daniel's disappearance to their reunion in the church, through the revelation about the Carpenter Manning family and the plan she and Daniel had begun to devise. Beatrice listened in silence, making occasional notes, her eyes fixed on Marina with an intensity that showed she was processing every piece of information. When Marina finished, Beatrice took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes as if she needed a moment to absorb the magnitude of what she had just heard. Then she looked at Marina and said with her characteristic frankness that the case was complicated, very complicated. The Carpenter Manning family had power, money, and connections, forging disappearance documents, manipulating records, keeping someone under surveillance, all. This required a considerable network of influence. Beatrice explained that without concrete evidence, it would be Daniel's word against that of one of London's most powerful families. And Daniel, in his current state as Pastor Luke, without official documentation to prove who he really was, would have little credibility before a court. Marina felt discouragement begin to set in, but Beatrice raised her hand, signaling that she wasn't finished. She said that, although it was difficult, it wasn't impossible. They needed evidence, documents, witnesses, records that showed the manipulation, and they needed allies, people who had as much to gain as they did from exposing the Carpenter Manning family's crimes. That's when Marina mentioned Julian Anderson. Beatrice seemed to recognize the name immediately. She explained that Julian had been one of the company's minority partners years ago and had been controversially removed, losing not only his stake but also much of his personal assets in prolonged legal disputes. Julian had tried to sue Marcus Carpenter, but without success. Beatrice said that if Julian still held a grudge, and if he had evidence, he could be a valuable ally. Marina asked how they could find Julian. Beatrice smiled for the first time. In the conversation, she said that coincidentally Julian had approached her office a few months ago, trying to reopen the case against Marcus. At the time, Beatrice said there were no new elements to work with, but now, with Daniel's return, everything changed. Julian Anderson had reasons to help, and Beatrice had the contacts to find him. The meeting with Julian was scheduled for 2 days later, at a discreet cafe in Shoreditch. Marina was accompanied by Daniel. It was the first time Daniel had left Peckham since their reunion, and he was visibly nervous. He wore a cap and dark glasses, trying to disguise himself, although Marina thought it drew more attention than it avoided. She said nothing. She understood his fear. Julian Anderson was a man in his 50s, with greying hair and tired eyes. He arrived punctually, greeted Beatrice familiarly, and looked at Marina and Daniel with curiosity. They sat at a secluded table, and Beatrice got straight to the point. She introduced Daniel as Luke, but explained who he really was. Julian was silent for a long moment, just observing Daniel. Then he asked for proof. Daniel took off his cap and glasses. Julian studied his face, mentally comparing it to the image he held from 10 years ago. Then Daniel began to speak. He recounted details that only someone from inside the company would know. Specific meetings, business decisions, even private family disputes that were never made public. Julian listened to everything, and gradually his expression changed from skepticism to surprise and, finally, to something that seemed a mix of anger and satisfaction. Julian said he always knew something was wrong with Daniel's disappearance. At the time, Marcus took control too quickly, too conveniently, and Roderick, who had never shown competence to lead, was suddenly in the presidency. Julian was sure there was manipulation, but he could never prove it. Now, with Daniel alive and willing to testify, there was a chance. He asked what they needed from him. Beatrice explained that they needed documents, records, anything that could prove irregularities in the company after Daniel's disappearance. Julian thought for a moment. He said he had some documents stored away, papers he had saved before being forced out of the company. Nothing conclusive, but perhaps enough to start an investigation. He also mentioned that he knew a former company lawyer, Dr. Claude, who had been dismissed around the same time Daniel disappeared. Claude might know more. Marina felt a spark of hope. It was working. Little by little, they were building a network, gathering people who, each with their own scars, had reasons to want to see the truth exposed. Beatrice wrote everything down, already mentally outlining a plan of action. Before they said goodbye, Julian looked at Daniel and said it was good to see him alive, that the company had never been the same without him. Daniel thanked him, but Marina noticed he didn't seem comfortable with the compliment. The person Julian remembered no longer existed. Daniel was someone else now, and Marina was still trying to understand who this new person was. In the following days, Julian handed over the documents he had. These were contracts, meeting minutes, financial records showing irregularities in transactions made soon after Daniel's disappearance. They were not direct proof of crime, but they were evidence that something was wrong. Beatrice began to analyze everything, cross-referencing information, looking for loopholes. Meanwhile, Marina and Daniel tried to locate Dr. Claude. They discovered that he had moved to Brighton on the English coast and was living a quiet life of early retirement. Marina called him, briefly explained the situation, and Claude agreed to receive them. There was something in his voice, a contained urgency, that suggested he also had things to say. The trip to Brighton was the first time Marina and Daniel had spent hours alone since their reunion. The car ride was silent at first, each lost in their own thoughts, but little by little they began to talk. Not about the family, not about the past, but about simple things. Daniel talked about his work at the church, about the people he had met, about how strange it was to have a life that seemed to belong to someone else. Marina talked about her years of searching, about the children she helped, about how she had learned to find meaning in the pain of others because she couldn't find meaning in her own. There was an oddness to this conversation. They were strangers who knew each other intimately, people who had once shared everything, but who now needed to get to know each other again. And Marina realized that perhaps this was the only way to move forward. Not by trying to rescue the past, but by building something new with the pieces that remained. Dr. Claude lived in a simple house near the beach. He was a man of almost 70, thin and slow-spoken. He welcomed them with coffee and cake, a gesture of hospitality that contrasted with the gravity of the subject they were about to discuss. They sat on the veranda, with the sea breeze bringing momentary relief from the tension. Claude looked at Daniel for a long time before speaking. He said that when Daniel disappeared, he immediately became suspicious. The week before the disappearance, Marcus had asked Claude to prepare documents for a transfer of power, claiming that Daniel wanted to step away from the company for personal reasons. Claude found it strange because Daniel had never mentioned anything of the sort, but Marcus was insistent. He said it was urgent, that Daniel was going through personal problems and needed time. Claude prepared the documents, but when Daniel officially disappeared, he realized he had been used. The papers he had prepared were part of the scheme to remove Daniel from control of the company. Claude tried to speak up, tried to report it, but Marcus fired him before he could do anything. And worse still, Marcus ensured that Claude was discredited in London's legal community, spreading rumors of incompetence and even unethical behavior. Claude remained silent for years, afraid of retaliation, but he never threw away the copies of the original documents. He said he always knew that one day the truth would come out, and that when it did, he would be ready. He stood up, went to a cupboard, and returned with an old folder. Inside, there were copies of contracts, printed emails, notes he had made at the time. It was gold. It was exactly the kind of evidence Beatrice needed. Daniel took the folder with trembling hands. He looked at Claude and asked why he had kept it for so long, why he hadn't tried to do anything before. Claude smiled sadly. He said he tried, but a single man has no power against a family like the Carpenter Mannings. But now, with Daniel alive and willing to fight, with Beatrice and Julian on their side, perhaps it would be different. Perhaps finally, there was a chance for justice. They thanked Claude and returned to London with the folder of documents. During the drive back, Marina realized that something had changed between her and Daniel. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close to acceptance. They were in the same boat now, rowing in the same direction, and however much the past still hurt, the future seemed, for the first time in 10 years, a real possibility. Back in London, Beatrice analyzed Claude's documents. She worked for days, cross-referencing information, consulting specialists, building a case, and finally, she called Marina and Daniel for a meeting. Beatrice was serious, but there was a determination in her eyes that Marina hadn't seen before. Beatrice said they had enough material to file a lawsuit. It wouldn't be easy and it would take time, but it was possible. She explained that the first step would be to prove Daniel's identity, which would require DNA tests and witnesses. Then they would use Claude's and Julian's documents to show the irregularities in the company, and if they could prove that the disappearance documents were forged, they could accuse Marcus and Roderick of various crimes, including fraud and embezzlement. But Beatrice issued a warning. She said that as soon as they filed the lawsuit, the Carpenter Manning family would react, and they would react strongly. They would try to discredit Daniel, perhaps even claiming he was an imposter. They would try to bribe or intimidate witnesses. They would use all available resources to protect their empire. Beatrice asked if they were prepared for this. Marina looked at Daniel. He was pale, but he nodded. He said he was tired of hiding, tired of living in fear, that if he had to face the family, then let it be now. Marina agreed. She was also tired of carrying the pain alone, tired of seeing injustice unpunished, tired of a life that seemed to be eternally in suspense. Beatrice smiled. She said that was it then. They were going to war, and that no matter what happened, she would be with them until the end. The lawsuit was filed on a Thursday morning. Beatrice submitted a request for Daniel's identity recognition, accompanied by a formal complaint against Marcus Carpenter and Roderick Carpenter for fraud, falsification of documents, and embezzlement. Claude's and Julian's documents were attached as preliminary evidence. The case was assigned to a judge, and the news began to circulate in the city's legal circles. It took less than 24 hours for the reaction to arrive. On Friday, the Carpenter Manning family's lawyers issued an official statement denying all accusations and claiming the lawsuit was an attempt at financial fraud by an imposter. They demanded that Daniel submit to DNA tests immediately and said the family was confident that the farce would be exposed. Daniel agreed to the tests. He had nothing to hide. The tests were scheduled for the following week, and while they waited, the tension increased. Marina barely slept, imagining all the ways Marcus might try to sabotage the process. Daniel was also restless, preaching less frequently at the church, spending long hours in silence as if mentally preparing for the battle to come. It was in the meantime that something unexpected happened. Marina received a call. It was a female voice, elderly, trembling. The woman identified herself as Mrs. Helen, the housekeeper of the old Carpenter Manning mansion. She said she needed to speak with Marina, that she had important information but couldn't talk on the phone. She asked Marina to come to her house in a residential neighborhood in North London. Marina was suspicious, but the urgency in the woman's voice convinced her. She informed Beatrice, who recommended caution, and went. Mrs. Helen lived in an old terraced house, well-maintained but marked by time. She opened the door, and Marina saw a woman over 70, short, with completely white hair, and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of many secrets. Mrs. Helen invited Marina in. The house smelled of lavender, and had that atmosphere of homes where time seems to pass more slowly. They sat in the living room, and Mrs. Helen served tea with trembling hands. Then she began to speak. She said she had worked for the Carpenter Manning family for over 40 years, that she had seen Daniel grow up, seen his marriage to Marina, and also seen what happened afterwards. Mrs. Helen said that at the time of the disappearance, she overheard conversations. Marcus and Roderick arguing in the office, thinking no one was listening. She heard when Marcus said Daniel needed to disappear, that he was an obstacle. She heard when Roderick asked if there was another way, and Marcus replied there wasn't. Mrs. Helen was afraid but didn't know what to do. She was just a servant. Who would believe her against the family? But now, seeing that Daniel was alive and that Marina was fighting for justice, Mrs. Helen said she could no longer remain silent. She was old, no longer afraid of losing her job. She was ready to testify, to tell what she heard. Marina felt tears well up. She hugged Mrs. Helen and thanked her. This was exactly what they needed. A direct witness, someone who had been there, who had overheard the conversations. Beatrice was euphoric when Marina told her. She said Mrs. Helen's testimony could change everything. But the good news was followed by bad. 2 days later, Daniel received a threat. It was a note left at the church door, unsigned, but with a clear message: "Give up or there will be consequences." Daniel showed the note to Marina and Beatrice. They were alarmed, but Beatrice said this was expected, that Marcus was afraid, and fearful people do desperate things. Beatrice suggested that Daniel and Marina stay in safe places, at least until the DNA tests were concluded and the case gained more public visibility. Julian offered an apartment he had in Chinatown, a discreet place where they could stay for a few days. Marina accepted, although the idea of hiding was frustrating, but she couldn't risk it. Not now when they were so close. In the Chinatown apartment, Marina and Daniel found themselves forced to live together in a way they hadn't since their marriage. The space was small, just a bedroom, a living room, and a kitchen. They shared meals, talked about the case, but also about other things. Daniel spoke about the people at the church, about how faith had helped him find himself when all seemed lost. Marina spoke about music, about how she had stopped playing after he disappeared, and how lately she felt like returning to it. One night after dinner, Daniel asked Marina to play something. She hesitated but eventually picked up an old guitar Julian had left in the apartment. She chose a simple song, one they used to listen to together. As she played, Marina closed her eyes, and for a moment, it was as if the 10 years hadn't happened. It was just her, Daniel, and the music. When she finished, Marina opened her eyes and saw that Daniel was crying. He said he had missed it so much. The music, her presence, the feeling of being home. Marina said nothing. She just put the guitar aside and, for the first time since their reunion, allowed herself to sit beside him on the sofa. They didn't touch, but the proximity was enough. It was a beginning. The results of the DNA tests arrived a week later. They were conclusive. Daniel was, without a shadow of a doubt, Daniel Carpenter Manning. The news was released and the reaction was immediate. The media began to cover the case. Newspapers published stories about the missing heir who had returned from the dead. Television programs debated the case. Public opinion was divided, but there was growing interest. Marcus and Roderick were forced to hold a press conference. Marcus, always composed, said they were surprised and happy with Daniel's return, but that many questions needed to be clarified. Roderick seemed nervous, averting his gaze from the cameras. Marina watched the conference with Daniel beside her. She saw the discomfort on their faces and knew they were worried. Finally, after 10 years, they were afraid. And Marina was just beginning. The week following the DNA results was a whirlwind. Reporters tried to locate Daniel. Investigative journalists began to scour the Carpenter Manning Company archives, and the pressure on Marcus and Roderick increased daily. Beatrice took advantage of the media attention to advance the lawsuit. She gave interviews, always cautious, but making it clear that there was evidence of serious crimes and that the Carpenter Manning family would have to answer for them. Marina and Daniel were still in the Chinatown apartment, but the feeling of being hidden began to weigh on them. Daniel missed the church, the people who depended on him, the Sunday services. He called congregation members, trying to stay in touch, but it wasn't the same. And Marina noticed that the longer they spent confined, the more restless Daniel seemed. That's when alarming news arrived. Peter, the boy who attended St. Clair's Outreach Center and who had been indirectly responsible for Marina and Daniel's reunion, called Marina in desperation. He said strange men had appeared in the neighborhood, asking questions about Pastor Luke, about the church, about where he lived. The community people were afraid, thinking something bad was about to happen. Marina felt her heart clench. She immediately called Beatrice, who in turn contacted Julian. They needed to find out what was happening. Julian used his contacts and within hours had troubling information. The Carpenter Manning Company had initiated an expansion project in Peckham. The plan was to displace several families to build a high-end commercial complex. And the New Path Church was right in the middle of the area they wanted to expropriate. It was no coincidence. Marcus was using the company to attack Daniel in another way. If he couldn't silence him through direct threats, he would try to destroy what Daniel had built in those years. The community where Daniel had found purpose, the people he helped, all of it was at risk. Daniel turned livid when he found out. He couldn't allow those people to lose their homes, their church, because of him. He said he was going back, that he was going to talk to the community, that he was going to fight. Marina tried to argue that it was dangerous, that Marcus might be expecting exactly that, but Daniel was unyielding. For the first time since their reunion, Marina saw Daniel's old determination, that strength she thought he had lost. Beatrice assessed the situation and agreed that they needed to act, but intelligently. She suggested they organize a press conference in the community itself. If Daniel appeared publicly, surrounded by journalists and residents, Marcus couldn't do anything without drawing even more negative attention to the company. It was risky, but it was also a way to turn the threat into an opportunity. Daniel agreed. Marina was nervous, but she knew there was no other choice. They returned to Peckham on a Thursday afternoon. The community was agitated, with worried residents circulating in the streets, talking in groups, trying to understand what was happening. When Daniel got out of the car, there was a moment of silence, and then people began to approach. They surrounded him, asking questions, looking for answers. Daniel raised his hands, asking for calm, and said he would explain everything. Beatrice had arranged for the press conference to take place on Sunday after the service, and until then, everyone should remain calm and trust that they would find a solution. Marina watched Daniel talking to the residents and saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Leadership. He was no longer the lost businessman nor the frightened pastor. He was someone in between, someone who was learning to unite the two versions of himself. And Marina realized that perhaps this was the person Daniel should always have been, not a forced heir nor a hidden refugee, but someone who chose to fight for what he believed in. On Saturday, Beatrice and her team worked to ensure the press conference received the widest possible coverage. She contacted journalists from various outlets, explained the community's situation, and how the Carpenter Manning Company was trying to use its power to intimidate witnesses and destroy the place where Daniel had rebuilt his life. The story had all the elements the media loved: power, betrayal, redemption, and a vulnerable community fighting against a corporate giant. On Sunday morning, the church was packed. There were residents, journalists, cameras, and a palpable tension in the air. Marina sat at the back as she had the first time, but now with a completely different feeling. It was no longer anxious searching, but the expectation of seeing Daniel confront the past publicly. The service began normally, with songs and prayers. The children sang, the faithful embraced, and for a few moments it was possible to forget the reason for all that external attention. But then it was Daniel's turn to speak. He stepped up to the pulpit, looked at the congregation, at the cameras, and took a deep breath. Daniel began by telling his story, not as Pastor Luke, but as Daniel Carpenter Manning. He spoke about the life of luxury he had, about the expectations he never wanted to fulfill, about the love he found in Marina. He spoke about the day he was kidnapped by his own family, about the terror of being held prisoner, about the desperate escape. He spoke about the lost years, about the amnesia, about how he had been welcomed by that same community that was now being threatened. The church was in absolute silence. People listened to every word with full attention. Daniel spoke with a firm voice, without averting his gaze, as if he was finally freeing himself from a weight he had carried for too long. He admitted his mistakes, admitted he was afraid to return when his memory came back, admitted he should have been braver. But he also said that that community had taught him what true love meant, not love based on power or money, but love that gives itself, that serves, that chooses to stay even when it would be easier to leave. And then Daniel spoke about the threat, about how his family's company was trying to evict people, destroy the church, all to silence him. He looked at the cameras and made a direct appeal. He said he would not allow those people to suffer because of him, that he would fight with all available resources to protect the community, and that, if necessary, he would give up any right to his family's fortune, to the company, to everything, as long as those families were spared. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the congregation stood up and applauded. It wasn't a polite or perfunctory applause. It was an ovation filled with emotion, support, and gratitude. Marina, sitting at the back, had tears streaming down her face. She saw Daniel, and for the first time she saw the man he could have been if he had had the chance to choose his own life from the beginning. After the service, the press conference took place. Daniel, Marina, and Beatrice sat at an improvised table outside the church, surrounded by dozens of journalists and residents. Questions came fast and intense, about the kidnapping, about the family, about the company's plans for the community. Daniel answered honestly, without evasion. Beatrice complimented with the legal aspects, explaining the actions that had already been filed and the next steps in the process. A journalist asked if Daniel intended to regain control of the company. Daniel looked at Marina before answering. He said he didn't know if he wanted to go back to that life, that his time away had taught him that power and money meant nothing if they were built on lies and suffering. But he also said that if recovering the company was the only way to protect those people and to achieve justice, then he would do what was necessary. The press conference lasted over 2 hours. When it ended, Daniel was exhausted but also relieved. It was as if a burden had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Marina approached, touched his arm briefly, and said he had done the right thing. Daniel smiled, a tired but genuine smile, and thanked her. The impact of the press conference was immediate. The videos went viral on social media. Daniel's speech was shared thousands of times, with emotional captions and supportive comments. Hashtags like Justice for Daniel and Protection for Peckham began to emerge. Public opinion, which had been divided, now leaned strongly in Daniel's favor. The story of the heir who chose to serve, instead of command, touched people in a way Marina hadn't foreseen. The Carpenter Manning family's reaction was disastrous. Marcus tried to give another interview, but journalists asked tough questions about the expropriation project in Peckham and about the fraud accusations. Marcus lost his composure, became defensive, and the interview ended abruptly. The next day, shareholders began to publicly question the company's management. Some demanded an independent audit. Others called for Marcus and Roderick's resignation. Beatrice seized the moment. She intensified legal actions, requesting a freeze on company assets until the irregularities were investigated. She also requested that Mrs. Helen be heard as a formal witness and that Claude and Julian be called to testify. The judge responsible for the case, pressured by public attention, accelerated the process. Meanwhile, the Peckham community mobilized. Residents organized peaceful protests in front of the Carpenter Manning Company offices. They carried signs with photos of their homes, their families, and the church. The media covered everything, and the company's image continued to deteriorate. Marina observed everything with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. They were winning, but she knew that desperate people did unthinkable things, and Marcus seemed increasingly desperate. She talked to Beatrice about her concerns, and Beatrice agreed that they needed to be cautious. She suggested that Daniel and Marina continue to take precautions, avoiding isolated places and always keeping trusted people nearby. But Daniel was tired of hiding. He said he had spent 10 years living in fear, and he wasn't going to spend the rest of his life like that. He wanted to resume his routine at the church. He wanted to go back to visiting families. He wanted to live. Marina understood, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. Marina's intuition was not wrong. On a Tuesday night, Daniel was approached on the street near the church. 2 men pushed him into a dark alley. Daniel tried to resist, but one of them showed a weapon. They didn't shoot, they just threatened him. They said Daniel should give up, that if he continued, someone would get hurt, and that next time, it wouldn't just be a threat. Daniel returned to the apartment where he was staying with Marina, pale and trembling. He told her what had happened, and Marina felt terror take over her. She immediately called Beatrice, who contacted the police. A police report was filed, and the police said they would increase patrols in the area. But Marina knew it wasn't enough. Marcus was willing to go far, very far, to protect his empire. Beatrice suggested they request protective measures from the judge. She also recommended hiring private security, at least temporarily. Julian, always willing to help, offered contacts for a reliable security company. In a few days, Daniel and Marina had security guards accompanying them wherever they went. It was strange, uncomfortable, but necessary. Despite the fear, Daniel didn't stop. He continued preaching, continued visiting families, continued leading the community's resistance against expropriation, and Marina was by his side every day, supporting, planning, fighting. They still hadn't fully resolved what they were to each other, whether there was a future for their marriage or if the past was too big to overcome. But at that moment they were allies, and that was enough. The turning point in the case came from an unexpected place. One of the men who had worked for Marcus during Daniel's kidnapping, a man named John, sought out Beatrice. He said he was tired, that he could no longer live with the weight of his conscience, and that he wanted to tell everything. Beatrice organized a confidential meeting, and John revealed details that even Daniel didn't know. He described how the kidnapping was planned, who was involved, where Daniel was held prisoner. And most importantly, he had recordings, conversations he had recorded as a way to protect himself in case Marcus tried to get rid of him too. The recordings were gold. In them, Marcus gave explicit orders about the kidnapping, about the falsification of documents, about how to manipulate the situation to make it seem like Daniel had disappeared voluntarily. There were even mentions of threats against Marina, should she become a problem. Beatrice could barely believe what she was hearing. She told John that he would have to testify formally and that he would likely face legal consequences for his participation in the crimes. But John said he was ready, that he preferred to pay for what he did than to continue being an accomplice to something so terrible. With John's testimony and the recordings, Beatrice filed a new petition requesting the preventive arrest of Marcus and Roderick. The judge analyzed the evidence and, in a historic decision, granted the request. Arrest warrants were issued, and in an operation carried out on a Thursday morning, Marcus and Roderick were detained. The news spread like wildfire. It was the headline of every newspaper, the subject of every program. The arrest of two members of one of London's most powerful families was unprecedented, and public opinion was overwhelmingly on Daniel's side. Marina and Daniel watched the news together in the apartment. There was a sense of unreality, as if it were all a dream. After so much time, so much struggle, they had succeeded. Justice, slow and imperfect, but real, was finally being served. Daniel held Marina's hand and she let him. They stood there in silence, just watching the images on television of Marcus and Roderick being taken into custody. There was no triumph, no celebration, just a deep, tired relief. Beatrice called soon after, euphoric. She said the process was gaining strength, that with the new evidence, it was practically certain that Marcus and Roderick would be convicted. She also informed them that the expropriation project in Peckham had been suspended and that there were real chances of it being permanently cancelled. Marina thanked Beatrice for everything. She said that, without her, none of this would have been possible. Beatrice replied that the merit was theirs, Daniel's for having the courage to return, and Marina's for never giving up. When she hung up, Marina looked at Daniel. He had his eyes closed, his head resting on the sofa, as if he was finally allowing himself to relax. She watched him for a long moment, his face marked by time, by the invisible scars of a lost decade, but still the same man she had loved, still Daniel. She called his name softly. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and Marina asked the question she had been avoiding for weeks. She asked what they would do now. Now that the truth was exposed, now that justice was being served, what would come next? Daniel thought for a long moment. He said he didn't know, that the life he had before no longer existed, and that the life he built as Pastor Luke had also changed forever. He was someone in between now, trying to discover who he really was. But he also said that if there was one thing he was sure of, it was that he wanted Marina in his life. Somehow, in some capacity, he wanted her to be there. Marina felt tears come. She said she wanted that too, but she didn't know if she could, that the pain was still there, latent, waiting, that forgiveness was a process, not an event, that it might take years for her to be able to look at him without remembering everything they had lost. Daniel nodded. He said he understood, and that if Marina needed time, space, distance, he would respect it, but that he would be there waiting for as long as necessary. Marina held his hand more tightly. She said she didn't want distance, that they had been distant for too long, but that they needed to rebuild, not what they had, but something new, something that respected the past, but was not defined by it. And Daniel agreed, because in the end, it was all they both could do. Move forward, one step at a time, trying to find a path between the ruins of what was and the uncertain promise of what could still be. The months that followed Marcus and Roderick's arrest were a succession of hearings, testimonies, and revelations. The case gained national proportions, with developments that went far beyond Daniel's kidnapping. Investigations revealed that the Carpenter Manning Company was involved in a series of irregularities: tax evasion, inflated construction costs, fraudulent contracts with public authorities. The empire that seemed so solid began to crumble, and each new discovery confirmed what Daniel had always known: that fortune had been built on rotten foundations. Mrs. Helen testified, as promised. Sitting in the witness box with trembling hands but a firm voice, she recounted everything she had seen and heard during her years working for the family. Her courage inspired other former employees to come forward, and in a short time there was a list of people willing to testify against Marcus and Roderick. Claude and Julian also testified, presenting documents and explaining the financial maneuvers that had been used to cover up the crimes. And John, the man who had participated in the kidnapping but decided to confess, became a key witness. His testimony was devastating for Marcus's defense. There was no longer any way to deny, no longer any way to manipulate. The truth was exposed, raw and undeniable. Throughout this process, Daniel attended every hearing. Marina was always by his side. They didn't talk much, but each other's presence was a silent comfort. The trial was long and exhausting, but Daniel maintained his composure. He answered all questions honestly, without dramatizing, without seeking pity, just stating the facts as they had happened. The verdict came on a rainy July afternoon. Marcus and Roderick were found guilty of kidnapping, falsification of documents, fraud, and a list of other crimes. Marcus was sentenced to 23 years in prison. Roderick, for having a role considered minor, received 15 years. The sentence was read by the judge with a solemnity that seemed to give final weight to a decade of injustices. When they left the courthouse, there was a crowd of journalists waiting. Daniel made a brief statement. He thanked everyone who supported him, especially Marina, Beatrice, Julian, Claude, and Mrs. Helen. He said that justice had been served, but that the real work was just beginning, that it was time to transform all that pain into something meaningful. The Carpenter Manning Company entered a restructuring process. Shareholders demanded radical changes in management, and that's when the question everyone expected arose: would Daniel regain control? Legally, he had the right. He was the legitimate heir, and the documents that had removed him from the company were declared null and void. But Daniel hesitated. He talked at length with Marina about it. She said the decision was his, that she would support him whatever his choice. Daniel spent weeks pondering, visiting the company, talking to former employees, trying to understand what he truly wanted. And then, at a meeting with the board of shareholders, Daniel made his announcement. He said he would not resume the company's presidency, that the person he had been, the one destined to command that empire, no longer existed, and that perhaps he never should have existed. He proposed something different, that the company be transformed, that a significant portion of the profits be directed to social projects, to community rebuilding, to repairing the damage caused over the years, and that management be handed over to competent and ethical people with independent oversight. The proposal was met with mixed reactions. Some shareholders were furious, thinking Daniel was wasting a fortune. Others, especially those who had been harmed by Marcus's management, supported it. After long negotiations, they reached an agreement. The company would be restructured according to Daniel's proposal, but he would retain a shareholding that would guarantee him sufficient income to live comfortably and to finance the projects he had in mind. Daniel accepted. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best he could do. He didn't want to get rich at the expense of others' suffering, but he also knew he needed resources to accomplish what he planned. The next step was the creation of the foundation. Daniel and Marina worked together on the project, spending hours planning, discussing, dreaming. They named the foundation New Beginnings, a simple name that captured the essence of what they wanted to do: help families with missing loved ones find answers, find some form of closure, of hope. The foundation would offer legal, investigative, and emotional support to families searching for missing people. It would have a team of lawyers, private investigators, psychologists, and social workers. And most importantly, it would be a place of welcome where people going through the same pain Marina experienced would not feel alone. Beatrice agreed to be the foundation's legal director. Julian became an advisor, using his business experience to ensure the institution was sustainable. And Mrs. Helen, despite her advanced age, volunteered, saying she wanted to dedicate her remaining years to doing the good she hadn't been able to do before. The inauguration of the foundation took place on a sunny Saturday in September, in the same borough where Daniel had been a pastor. The Peckham community turned out in force, proud to see that one of their own was making a difference. There were also families from all over the country who had come, each carrying photos of missing loved ones, each carrying stories of pain and hope. Daniel gave the opening speech. He spoke about his own experience, about the 10 lost years, about the reunion. He spoke about Marina, who stood by his side on the stage, and how her love never gave up even when it would have been easier to do so. And he spoke about the responsibility we all have to care for each other, to not allow people to disappear without someone caring, without someone searching. Marina also spoke. For the first time publicly, she recounted her years of searching, her nights of crying, the feeling of being lost in a world that kept spinning while hers had stopped. But she also spoke about hope, about how even in the darkest moments, something inside her refused to give up, and now she wanted to offer that same hope to other people. The line of families who sought out the foundation on that first day was long. Each story was a universe of pain, but also of love. Parents looking for children, children looking for parents, siblings, spouses, friends. Each photo shown was a face someone loved, someone who was missed. And the foundation's team dedicated themselves to listening to each story, noting every detail, promising to do everything in their power to help. Marina worked late that day, talking to families, taking notes, offering words of comfort. Daniel was in another room doing the same. When they finally met at the end of the night, both were exhausted, but also fulfilled. This was it. This was exactly what they wanted to do with the time they had left. In the following months, the foundation began to show results. Some families found answers, not always happy, but at least definitive. Others were still in the process of searching, but no longer felt alone. The foundation became a national reference, and invitations began to arise for Daniel and Marina to speak at conferences, to share their experiences, and inspire similar initiatives. But it was in their personal lives that the most significant changes happened. Marina and Daniel continued working together every day, and little by little, the wound between them began to heal. It wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, but it was real. They started talking about small things again, about music, about dreams, about fears. And one night, months after the foundation's inauguration, Daniel asked the question he had been holding on to for so long. They were in the foundation's office late, after everyone had left. Marina was organizing papers, and Daniel was sitting just watching her. He called her name, and when she turned, she saw that his eyes were teary. Daniel said he understood if Marina could never completely forgive him, that he understood if the love she had felt had died somewhere in that lost decade, but that he needed her to know that, for him, nothing had changed. He still loved her, always had, and always would. Marina felt tears fall. She approached him, knelt beside the chair where he was sitting, and held his hands. She said that love never died, that it had been wounded, hurt, almost destroyed, but never dead. And that yes, she still needed time, still had days when the pain returned with force, days when she wondered if she could overcome everything. But she also said that she wanted to try, that she wanted to rebuild, not the marriage they had, but a new one that was theirs, both of them, built on truth and choice. Daniel embraced Marina, and she let him hold her. They stayed like that for a long time, just the two of them, in the silence of the office, with the city of London pulsating outside. There were no grand promises, no guarantees, but there was hope. And at that moment, hope was enough. A year after the foundation's inauguration, in a simple ceremony held at the New Path Church, Marina and Daniel renewed their vows. It was not a traditional wedding. It was more a celebration of survival, of resilience, of choice. The entire congregation was there, along with Beatrice, Julian, Claude, Mrs. Helen, Mrs. Lucy, and all the people who had supported them throughout that impossible journey. Daniel didn't wear a suit. Marina didn't wear a wedding dress. They were dressed simply as they were, every day. And when they exchanged their vows, they were not traditional words. They were real, honest promises. Promises to choose each other every day, even on difficult days. Promises to build something new, respecting the past, but not being prisoners of it. Promises to love, not with the naivety of someone who has never suffered, but with the wisdom of someone who knows how much love can cost and still chooses to pay the price. When the pastor asked if they accepted each other, both answered yes. And then Daniel and Marina kissed, not like at their first wedding, but like two people who had traversed hell and decided it was still worth trying to find heaven together. The reception was modest, but joyful. There was music, there was food, there were children running, and adults talking. Peter, who was now 12 and much taller, played the guitar while some members of the congregation sang. Marina danced with Daniel, and this time, unlike the first time, she knew exactly who she was dancing with. Not the heir, not the pastor, but Daniel. Just Daniel. At the end of the night, when the guests had left and they were alone, in the small church hall, Daniel led Marina to a private room. He said he had something to show her. He took an old box from a cupboard and pulled out a letter. It was the letter he had written years ago, the one he mentioned at the end of his story, but which had never been delivered. Marina took the letter with trembling hands. Daniel's handwriting was unmistakable, even after so long. The date at the top of the letter was 10 years ago, a few days before his disappearance. Marina began to read, and with each line the tears returned. In the letter, Daniel spoke about his fears, about how he felt something was wrong in the family, about how he feared they would try to separate them. He wrote that if something happened to him, if one day he disappeared, Marina needed to know it wasn't because he didn't love her. It was because he loved her too much to drag her into the dangerous world he was beginning to perceive around him. He wrote that he hoped she would be happy, that she would find someone who could love her without bringing danger, someone who could give her the peaceful life she deserved. But Daniel also wrote that if there was a way to come back, if there was any possibility, he would. Because a life without Marina was not life. It was just existence. And that he preferred a risky existence by her side to a safe life without her. Marina finished reading and looked at Daniel. She asked why he never delivered the letter. Daniel said that on the morning he was going to deliver it, that's when he received Roderick's call about the problem at the construction site. He left in a hurry, leaving the letter on the table, planning to deliver it when he returned. But he never returned, and the letter got lost among the belongings collected from the mansion, kept by Mrs. Helen, who, years later, found it and returned it to Daniel. Marina hugged Daniel and cried. She cried for all they had lost, but also for all they had found, because that letter, written 10 years ago, was still true. Daniel still loved her, and she still loved him. And together, despite everything, they had found their way back to each other. The years that followed were filled with work and rebuilding. The foundation grew, helping hundreds of families. Daniel continued to preach occasionally at the New Path Church, but his main focus was the foundation. Marina returned to teaching music, but now to the children of the community, teaching them to find beauty even amidst difficulties. They bought a small house in Peckham, near the church and the foundation. It wasn't luxurious, but it was theirs. It was a home built on real choices, not on imposed obligations. Every morning they woke up together, had coffee together and planned the day together. And every night, before going to sleep, they gave thanks for having found each other again. There were difficult days, days when Marina woke up with the old pain weighing on her chest, days when Daniel felt guilty for all it had cost them both. But they learned to talk about these pains, not to hide them, to face them together. And little by little the difficult days became rarer, and good days became the norm. The Carpenter Manning family never fully recovered. The company continued to exist, but under new management and with a tarnished reputation. Eliza, Daniel's mother, tried to reconnect with her son, years later, when she was already ill and repentant. Daniel visited her a few times, more out of compassion than filial love. Marina accompanied him, and together they offered forgiveness. Not because Eliza deserved it, but because they themselves needed it. Forgiving was not about the person who erred, it was about freeing oneself from the burden of carrying resentment. Marcus and Roderick served their sentences. Daniel never visited them, not out of hatred, but simply because there was nothing left to say. That chapter was closed and Daniel chose not to reopen it. Mrs. Lucy, Marina's mother, lived to see her daughter happy again. She passed away peacefully at 82, surrounded by her daughter, the son-in-law she had grown to love, and the certainty that Marina would be well. At the funeral, Marina sang her mother's favorite song, and Daniel held her hand the entire time, a silent but unwavering presence. Mrs. Helen worked at the foundation until her last days. She said it was her way of atoning for years of silence, of finally doing something that mattered. When she passed, Daniel and Marina organized a beautiful ceremony, celebrating her courage, the transformation she chose to make in her last years of life. Beatrice continued as the foundation's legal director, taking on impossible cases and winning most of them. She became a national reference in family law and human rights, and always, in every interview, she mentioned that the inspiration for her work came from Daniel and Marina, from the example of resilience they represented. Julian rebuilt his own life. With Marcus's downfall, he managed to recover some of what he had lost. He invested in small businesses, helped finance the foundation, and found peace in a simpler life, away from the ambitions that almost destroyed him. Peter grew up and became a lawyer, inspired by Daniel and Marina's story. He joined the foundation's team as soon as he graduated, dedicating himself to helping other children who, like him one day, needed hope. And the New Path Church continued to be a beacon in the Peckham community. The expropriation project was never resumed. The church grew, not in size, but in impact. And every Sunday, people of all kinds gathered there, finding welcome, love, and the certainty that, no matter how dark the night, there is always the possibility of a new dawn. 10 years after renewing their vows on a Sunday afternoon, Daniel and Marina were sitting on their porch watching the street activity. Children played, neighbors chatted, life unfolded in its noisy and beautiful simplicity. Daniel held Marina's hand, as he did every day, and she rested her head on his shoulder. He asked if she was happy. Marina smiled. She said that happiness was not a straight line, not a constant state. It was made of moments, of choices, of small joys amidst inevitable sorrows. And yes, all things considered, considering the path they had walked, she was happy, deeply, completely happy. Daniel kissed the top of her head and said he was too, that he never imagined that after everything it would still be possible to feel peace. But there he was, beside the woman who never gave up on him, living a life that had meaning, a life that mattered. Marina looked at the sky, at the slow-moving clouds, and thought about everything they had lived through. A lost decade, another decade rebuilding. 20 years of a story that could have been tragic, but which they chose to transform into redemption. It wasn't perfect. The pain still existed, the scars were still there. But they were survivors. And more than that, they were victors, not because they defeated their enemies, but because they overcame despair, because they chose, every day, to believe that it was still worth trying. And as the sun set over London, painting the sky in golden and orange hues, Daniel and Marina remained seated side by side, hands intertwined, hearts finally at peace. Because in the end, after all they had been through, they had learned the most important lesson, that true love is not one that never faces storms. It is one that, even after being destroyed by the storm, chooses to rebuild, stone by stone, choice by choice, day by day. And this was their story, a story of loss and reunion, of pain and healing, of justice and new beginnings. A story that proved that even when all seems lost, even when darkness seems eternal, there is always the possibility of a new morning. One just needs the courage to keep breathing, to keep hoping, to keep loving. Because in the end, love is the only thing that truly matters. And Marina and Daniel had proven that. With every tear, with every choice, with every moment they decided not to give up. They had proven that love, when true, does not die. It merely transforms, and it is reborn, always reborn. Dear listeners, we hope Marina and Daniel's story has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of love, loss, and new beginnings, please leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what stood out to you most. Every day, we bring intense stories like this, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, making us reflect on courage, forgiveness, and hope. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode.